You talked about it as a sort of a spasm, in favour of regulations. Where does that come from? And why is it still kind of supported? I mean, so, because we know that going back to 2020, we went very rapidly from an attempt to just encourage sort of voluntary kind of stay apart from each other behaviour to then this demand for rules. And thinking back to that, I think is very interesting, because we have an attempt to codify all of those, those implicit rules of social behaviour and all those mores, all of those norms in these bewildering pieces of hyper-regulation. And, you had government officials getting very excited about doing that. But you also had quite a lot of public appetite for it, didn't you?
Well, that's absolutely true. I think if you try to think back to the beginning, 2020, March 2020, several different strands came together. You had people who'd never lived through a pandemic like this before, who started to see news reports, which were hyped up as news on many things is. That made them fearful. Many of them, and you're the sociologist, not I, live very atomised lives where they're more in communication with the stories that come out of their mobile phone, which they're looking at all the time, than their conversation with the person in the club or the pub or the society or with their own family. And this fed into a loop of fear that increased and increased. And many people failed in this to get a real grasp of how dangerous or otherwise the virus was. The evidence was there from the Diamond Princess, the cruise ship outbreak in February, March 2020, that you got lots of infections in the crew who were mostly young. There was, as I recall, no mortality among the crew. The passengers on a cruise ship tend to comprise the newlyweds and the nearly deads, as somebody once unkindly put it. And among the elderly, there was 1 or 2% mortality. That, in a closed environment of a cruise ship, actually told you everything you needed to know about this disease. But the fever of the crowd builds up. And I think Matthias Desmet in Belgium, University of Ghent in Belgium, has it at least partly right here, in that you got one of these crowd madnesses, a mass formation. The government started off actually saying something sensible. They went to the 2011 pandemic influenza plan, which accepted that there would be spread of the disease, try to keep people calm, you would ultimately get a herd immunity, and yes, there would be mortality, but it was unavoidable. But the government were overwhelmed first by the crowd and then second by their own advisors on SAGE, who believed that somehow this time round it could be controlled, it could be stopped, that Neil Ferguson argued that his mathematical estimate of 500,000 deaths could be brought down to 20,000 if only intermittent lockdowns were brought in while a medical answer in terms of a vaccine was developed. Now, that was a tremendous gamble, because there was no certainty that a vaccine could be developed in that period, let alone a good vaccine. Now, ultimately, we've ended up with vaccines which, to my mind, are rather mediocre, but do have some benefit at the margins. But this coming together of a crowd that was panicked, together with a government which was pressed upon by scientific advisors, led, at least in the UK, to the abandonment of the plan of the UK's influenza preparedness plan, 2011, which was more or less what the Swedes followed. Now, Sweden didn't bring in lockdowns. They stuck to their guns. They somehow didn't, for whatever reason, whether it was press, whether it was a population who were inherently more stoical, I don't know, stuck to their guns and actually got through this pandemic far, far better than we did. They've had ultimately lower excess mortality. Their virus cases back in 2020 peaked no worse than ours. Like us, they had bad spread in old age care homes, and that led to mortality. But they did no worse than us for, in the early stage. In the later stages, they did much better than us, and they did far less damage to their society. So really,
Yes.
it was a coming together of this crowd who were fearful and panicked, together with a government that pivoted and ran with them. One, because they were doing what they thought the people want, I suspected, but two, because they got this advice, exaggerated advice from their medical advisors.